Dr. Manusheka Celeste. She's an associate professor at the Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies Research and African American Studies program at the University of Florida. She's the author of Race, and Gender and Citizenship in the African Diaspora, Traveling Blackness, winner of the 2018 National Communication Association Diamond Anniversary Book Award, and the 2017 National Communication Association Outstanding Book Award from the African American Communication and Cultural Division and the Black Caucus. She researches media representation of race, gender, class, sexuality, and nation, and processes of identity formation. She focuses on citizenship, narratives surrounding immigration, tourism, and black womanhood. Geographically, she specializes in the US and the Caribbean, especially Haiti. Dr. Celeste holds a PhD in communication and a graduate certificate in feminist studies from the University of Washington, and an MA in communication and a BS in journalism from the University of Florida. Her talk today, based on her upcoming book project, is entitled The Wailing Black Woman, Interrupting Narratives of Life, Death, and Citizenship. Please help me welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, and we have a
Oh,
gift.
I love presents. Thank you. I'm going to put it here. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I know it's lunchtime, and we're not giving you lunch. They're like, well, we should have had lunch, but we're going to have lunch for the soul. I usually do really fun topics like immigration, but I decided to shift and study death for this next book, and so we're going to keep, keep the excitement going. So let me pull up hopefully F5 still works. Yes. Excellent. Okay. So thinking about what I wanted to share, I'm working on this project. I've been spending most of the semester writing 1,000-word versions of what the book is going to be, and so I'll share with you a little sliver. And if you're really excited, you can talk to me after about what the rest of it looks like, or you can buy it in about a year or two. So I want to hold up 4 groups of black women in mind. I think there's not often spaces where black women are held up. So if you can imagine holding up black feminists, black mothers, the musical group Sweet Honey in the Rock, who you just heard, and Rihanna, because it's Rihanna. And so I'll offer a snippet of this research on black women in media, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So black feminist media scholars make visible black women's stories and intellectual contributions in a mediascape where we are either hypervisible or invisible. In writing about black women in media, this group of scholars offers criticism, which, as literary scholar Barbara Christian argues, is a response to those to whom there is often no response. Notably, most scholars in this area that I use and talk about, they do this work that becomes about bridging black feminism with media studies. And so I go back to Anna Julia Cooper, one of our founding mothers of black feminist ideas, who says, "'Tis woman's greatest vindication for speaking that the world needs to hear her voice." Black feminist media studies scholars write ourselves into history and into media studies so that we may continue to exist in our own fashioning and image. And that, for me, is sort of the framework that we're going to work through, the idea of black feminist media studies. So I'm going to provide an example of this kind of analysis. So what I was playing earlier was Sweet Honey in the Rock. Who loves Sweet Honey in the Rock? Yes, a few of you. If you don't, please go back and spend the whole day on YouTube listening to their music. It's quite important. But I'll start with somebody who you may know, and that is Queen Rihanna. And that's where I'll start, just in terms of thinking about the work itself. So in her hit song, Rihanna belts out, "And I just want to scream, what now? I just can't figure it out." She announces the oncoming shout that expresses anguish and frustration, lamenting her precarity. Many of the diasporic black women scholars, we talk about this idea of women's emotions, black women's emotions, but through Rihanna's song, you can hear her talk about a similar scream or wail in this contemporary moment where we navigate our precarious relationship with the state and society at large. Black women continue to wail throughout history, and so in the piece that you'll hear, I explore Black women's representations of public grief, so grieving in media, grieving in public spaces, starting with TV, because who doesn't love TV? Beginning with the First 48. Who's watched that show, the First 48? If you haven't, I don't know if we recommend it or not, but you're going to hear about it today. You can decide after this via a trope that I call Black feminists. That I call the Wailing Black Women. So this is a bit of the overview. We'll go through a lot of stuff. There's going to be some history. We'll talk about the show. We'll talk about Herman Gray, who I adore, and then we'll do some other things. So I do want you to get a bit of grounding of how I deal with Rihanna and how Rihanna helps me write about Black women after a commercial, apparently. Capitalism is an interesting thing. So this is there something else playing? There might be, are they playing? It's a little creepy. It's a little. I am writing about death. You might have some ghosts in the computer. I don't know. Do you hear that? I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm just gonna step back until. Is there something happening? There's nothing. Okay. Not creepy at all. I think this is going to be an interesting day. All right. So I can't see my own screen. Okay. So I situate this analysis of Black women in media, and I can't see my own screen, actually. Is that? Sorry, I can't see it. It did. If someone's watching live, you can enjoy the awkward silence. We can close one, I guess. Okay. All right. So I situate this analysis and conversation with this longer trajectory of women, mothers specifically, Black women specifically, mourning, and they mourn to bring attention to injustices and to participate in community healing. And so I answer Herman Gray's call to address the effective labor of images, what he calls the gathering of sentiment, feelings, and intensities around media images, and coverage of people of color. So I asked these two questions, and hopefully there's an answer by the end for you. How does the deployment of wailing Black women relate to hegemonic narratives of Black death, criminality, and citizenship? And what are the potential interventions of her effective labor? So Stuart Hall, Herman Gray, similar love, talks about the necessary work of critical scholars to not just say, is this image good, is this image bad, what does this image do? He wants us to think about what the image does in terms of feelings. And so he says that we have to reckon with matters of concern and what that might encourage, and to expand our assumptions and indices for assessing questions of legibility, parity, accountability, and to trace exactly how media images organize and circulate powerfully effective means of gathering and assembling sentiment, attachment, disidentification to public policies, bodies, histories, and cultures. So he's talking about when we watch these shows where you have people who are imprisoned, right, or people dying, what kind of feelings does that create in terms of how we deal with policy, but also how we deal with who we think belongs and doesn't belong in our spheres. So wailing Black women, I want to think that my things are so original, but they've been wailing forever, including in biblical times. And so you have scholars who've traced back the work of women who were called to mourn for the community. And Clausens goes back and talks about these women as a powerful symbol of survival to injured people seeking to come to terms with tragedy. So these are women who respond to and help communities respond to trauma. So we go back, if you're into the Bible, you can pull out your app, I don't know, to Jeremiah 9, 17 through 20, with the Bible saying that God says, behave with understanding, summon the women who sing Digger's songs of mourning, and send for the skilled women to come, so that they may hurry and raise lamentation for us, so that our eyes may stream with tears. So there's a really long trajectory of women wailing. Mothers who mourn in public ways that help us also understand that some of these deaths are not just deaths, but they're systemic, they're structural. And so one example that I always appreciate are the mothers in Argentina who, when their children disappeared, right, the mothers have disappeared, appear every Thursday to protest, to ask where their children are, and they've been protesting for more than 30 years, but they've also become a political force, right? So people go to them for advice, but they've turned their public grieving into a pretty sustained political movement. We also have a long history of Black women wailing in public, and so I offer one historical example, but then unfortunately we have a lot of contemporary examples. And so we remember the mother of Emmett Till, who decided very purposefully, very politically, to have an open casket to show her son who was murdered. And so she becomes an iconic wailing Black mother. We also have not wailing, but still mourning publicly, Dr. Martin Luther King's wife, Coretta Scott King, who we see at the funeral. So there's a long history of Black women mourning in public that's become quite iconic. We include in these images the contemporary versions, which is the mothers of young Black boys, young Black men, increasingly young Black women, including the mother of Brown, Davis, and Martin, who were killed by the state apparatus, and or killed by people who felt empowered by the state, and their killers, for the most part, were acquitted by the state. And so you have Sabrina Fulton, you have Leslie McFadden, you have Valerie Bell, who joins Mamie Till among many others. And we, of course, just a few weeks ago, have another addition to this group of mothers. Okay. So the first 48. If you haven't seen it, it begins in a city somewhere, usually in a urban center. It's the opposite of Law and Order, because Law and Order is actually kind of entertaining, right? And so it's a little racist, but it's also entertaining. So sirens wail throughout the first 48, be it from law enforcement vehicles or black women in mourning. The presence of black women grieving also reflects the realities of what is happening in working class, poor, and broadly communities of color across the U.S. As the show scans the cityscape, the cameras provide evidence of abandoned businesses and industry, lack of safe green space, and unkept public spaces, including schools, revealing communities neglected by the state in distress. Moreover, the presence of the victims, children and family, while it garners some empathy or sympathy for some, also functions as a reminder that when the case is solved, the material conditions do not change. The first 48 displays black women in pain, which has the power to facilitate connections with viewers and humanize their loved ones. But the show then very quickly moves on to the next tragic story, negating the power of her presence and her intervention. And so I'll offer a few stories as examples of wailing black women in the show, and then highlight some of the themes that emerge from the show. So these themes are, if you have a paper to write for extra credit, consent and surveillance, the normalization of dead black bodies, and blaming the victim. So I select these 4 women as their appearances most clearly speak to the themes, particularly that of surveillance. The presence of these black women themselves, disrupt narratives that normalize black death and poverty. And so in the moments when their loved ones could be anonymous to viewers, because oftentimes these people become anonymized, the women offer humanizing counter narratives. And so I use McCarthy here, who writes a reality TV show called Random One, in thinking about this idea that reality TV becomes a theater of suffering, right? So the neoliberalism theater of suffering. And so the one show, Random One, tells us at both that these things are banal, right? Everyday, kind of boring, and very much part of how we imagine things being filled with possibility. And so at any moment in this show, somebody might die, somebody might go to jail, somebody will break down, right? So we're watching these, waiting for these moments to happen. And so these mothers and wailing black women potentially push viewers to break out of the banality, in which the show depicts death, right? So if you're watching the show, if you watch a marathon of the show, anybody do that? That's fun. So if you ever watch a marathon of the show, it's constant death, right? And it becomes like, pass the ketchup. But when these women appear, it causes a bit of disruption where you can't just continue to watch, or you may have to take a break. So the show includes raw responses of the mothers who lost their children. And so in one case, in the show that's called The Deal Breaker, they all have these interesting names. Deal Breaker Gunplay. A black teenage boy is killed by a schoolmate in Tucson, Arizona. So his unnamed mother, so usually the mothers have names, sometimes they don't. She appears, I'm going to fast forward. So she appears, so his unnamed mother, wearing long braids and a purple bathrobe, is met by detectives and cameras outside. So she's lured outside of her home, because they have tricky things to get people on camera, to get the news. So she stands next to her taller husband, who in the show appears to be white, but because it's outside in the dark, it's hard to see all their features. And so she leans into a SUV and begins to cry when detectives tell her what happened to her son. So she reveals more of her story, including regrets, where she says, and I have the quote here, why didn't I go pick him up, right? So the son calls to get picked up, and then she doesn't pick him up, and so you have her then taking responsibility for his death. And then she leans back into the car. At the end of the scene, she walks back into her house silently. So she's called outside of her house, and this is where we watch her process her grief out loud, and she assigns blame to herself, this happens publicly in her driveway and not in the privacy of her home. And so the way that this show functions, it films in predominantly poor communities, with some neighborhoods being characterized as violent, and they use the code word urban, which we know urban is code for ethnic, right? And the women in the show themselves have a range, a bit of a range. So their mothers, their girlfriends, their wives, their partners, and most of them are relatively young. And a few of the women themselves are victims of homicide. And so the people killed on this show are overwhelmingly young, black, and male. And those who are not black are Latino, Latinx men. And so it's a very much us watching men of color, young men of color, be killed. And so in most episodes, the families are notified, and it's around minute 6. So I start to track when these things happen. There's formulas for TV shows. So around minute 6, you're like, oh, it's coming, right? So they're notified, and of course, their reactions are shown. The family notifications are often brief, but are crucial because they are some of the only moments, the few moments, where we're introduced to the mourning black women or the mourning mothers. And so I'll offer another example. Another mother, Anita, a young woman, witnesses the killing of her boyfriend and the father of her children in Miami. Cameras pan the streets, filming a group of onlookers who appear to be mostly black. A suspected drug dealer is charged with killing this young man. So the first angle is always, is this person in the gang? Are they a drug dealer? Right? That becomes sort of like the automatic story that they go to. In this case, it was a suspected drug dealer. So a white male police officer comments on the crime with this young man's body lying on the scene. So you often still have the bodies lying on the scenes. You may not see their face, but you see limbs. You see the body covered with white sheets. And so the officer says, this is ridiculous, overkill. They wanted this guy dead, I mean badly. So his comments point to the extent of violence exercised on the victim, and also lends to the question of what did this young man do to not only get killed, but to get overkilled. His girlfriend's account appears as a contrast and shifts from the law enforcement's point of view of overkill to thinking about his life. So she appears in an interrogation room where she shares the details of their last moments together as they interviewed her. And so she initially is calm, but then says, I told him, don't go. I love him, and that he had 2 kids to live for. And this is where she begins to cry, and then places her hand on his chin, and she continues, and don't do this. And this is what she's telling him not to go, not to die, right? Because she's there at his death. She conveys that he is more than just another body on the streets. It is not until the girlfriend enters the story that the storyline adds dimensions to this young man. So by identifying the people who will also suffer from his death, his family, she offers a moment that this corpse becomes a person. Her intervention is her presence. And her words allow for an alternative reading of this young man's life and death. She moves him from a dead body on the street with curious strangers hovering. The show somehow always managed to get random people hovering over the dead body. I don't know how they do it. Like predatory birds fly over an animal corpse on the road. We've seen this when we're driving. So she moves him from being this to a person over which this young woman cries. And so while the show's narrative is based on continuous Black death, Anita provides language and a counter narrative through which to understand this young man's life. Another young woman named Dominique, speaking through her tears, similarly individualizes and humanizes her partner in Cincinnati. She also witnesses the killing of her boyfriend, and while they're both out with their children, so they're out and then the shooting happens. On the scene, the camera scans to show figures, again with Black bystanders near the deceased man. One woman is kneeling. A bloody white sheet covers the body of this 19-year-old. The camera, again, scans the scene, lingers on an identified group of onlookers, and a storefront for Cash for America which is a payday loan business that is a part of an industry under scrutiny for predatory loaning, which of course they target poor communities when they do this. So the camera angle gives the viewer the vantage point of the bystander, looking to catch a peek of this anonymous dead person. 3 minutes later, his girlfriend appears talking to detectives. So she looks ahead, and then her eyes look down, and the camera films her up close, right, from the side. And she says, and the quote is on the screen, "I grabbed my baby because I seen she had blood on her and thought she shot my baby. But that was from my baby daddy pushing her out of the way. That was when I realized that my baby daddy was on the ground, and she begins to cry. And I just got on the ground crying, asking him not to leave me. And he told me he loved me, and he closed his eyes, and I knew he was dead." At this point, she puts both her hands along with a tissue that she's holding to cover her eyes, and she cries and she labors to breathe. He is killed by another young black man that he met while he was incarcerated. That he was killed by another young black man who is also part of the prison industrial complex is a condemnation of the system itself. Even more spectacular than one homicide, 48 has a special version where they showcase multiple homicides. And this is the episode that's called Lester Street, where an unnamed mother experiences a catastrophic loss with the death of 2 generations of her family that we find out at the end is killed by one family member. So the 48 highlights this show because it garnered national attention. The arc of the story centers on these moments of grief and forgiveness that came from a woman who lost her son, her grandchildren, all in one incident. So this happens in Memphis. They actually have a lot of Memphis episodes. The bloody scene is filmed from windows of the house where 4 adults and 2 children were found dead. 2 other children were in critical condition, so they managed to survive. They managed to survive it. And so the episode also includes news coverage. Right? So you have them filming, but you have them cutting in and out from news clips. So they have their investigation, which begins, of course, with searching gangs and drugs connections, which is common, right, for these types of shows. So the family appears on the local news with the mother of the victim crying. And this is quote, "I lost my baby and my grandbabies, and they're gone for what? And I don't know why." At the end of the episode, one of the surviving children who pointed to an unlikely suspect, his uncle, the child speaks. The uncle, who recently finished a prison sentence, breaks down in tears and confesses to killing the people in the house. But he says he was aiming for his brother. When asked about the children while crying, he says, "I tried to get rid of the kids." He says he went to kill the brother, but attempted to kill everyone so that there were no witnesses left. 48 records his confession with his mother present and gets her response. So she hugs him, she holds his hand, and she fights back her tears, and she says, "I love you, okay? Don't cry." In the moments after losing one son and her grandchildren at the hand of another son, this woman's story pointedly signals the fate of many. Their life circumstances brought one son to a gang and the other son to prison. While one can ask about personal agency and responsibility, this interaction makes visible the social, economic, and structural issues that shape the everyday life of this mother, of the son, and of these grandchildren. And at the end, the living son said he did not feel like the family supported him while he was incarcerated, and he felt isolated from society. So as we're talking about private prisons, the increase of putting refugees and immigrants in prison, but also cutting off access to families while people are in prison, right? This is the kind of isolation that's created within people who feel like they don't have access to their families, but also society at large. So the mother expressed the need to forgive her son in this incident is also, I think, an indictment of the justice system, the educational system, the caste system, all of which are informed by race, which work together to cause her pain. Unable to escape the cameras, these women live and relive their anguish in front of an audience. So the black women in these episodes provide pain for others to consume and to find pleasure. Black death and pain have long been entertainment in U.S. history, evidenced by postcards of lynchings and lynching picnics, along with countless examples of this throughout history. So today's particular iteration is aided by the rapidly evolving technology. We watch people get killed on Twitter. We watch the videos of them getting killed on Facebook. So the ability to share materials instantaneously on social media for different reasons, right? Some to create outrage and cause social change, others literally for entertainment. And so while scholars look back on lynching as a spectacle, today's black murder may be theorized as ritual. One can partake in it as a regularly scheduled program or binge watch. So the effective and political power of black women wailing lies in both acknowledging the cruelty and the turning of the lens outward to the many issues of her pain. So we understand, we see her suffering, yes, but she's also saying here's why, right? We're forced to, as we're watching the show, deal with the why. The vibrations of black women wailing, calling out racialized, class, and gendered injustices, raises and re-raises this nation's consciousness, particularly in this decade. And unlike the first 48, which is an hour show that promises more of the same in every episode, you can literally set your clock to what happens when. The wail of a few black women reverberates for months, for years, and for decades. The wailing black women we talked about a bit earlier has a long legacy of consciousness raising. She has many occasions to do so. And so, again, we have the Emmett Till example and many others, right? And I want to spend a little bit of time just reminding us of the Emmett Till example, especially for those who aren't as familiar. So on August 28, 1955, teenager Emmett Till was tortured and then murdered. And his mother mourned and wailed publicly. Scholars, including Fred Moten and Rebecca Marks, cite the mother's words as she reflects on her loss. And these are the words from Till Mobley. I looked up, saw that box, and I just screamed, oh, God, my only boy. And I kept screaming as the cameras kept flashing in one long explosive moment that would be captured for the morning edition. It was as if everyone was pouring out all at once. Everything was pouring out all at once. At that moment, there was nothing in the world but that giant crate. Death to me was much larger than life. It was overpowering. It was terrifying. It seemed that if I could scream loudly enough, I could get that feeling out of me. And this is what wailing is, right? It's getting that feeling out of you. Till Mobley's open casket funeral for her son was a deliberate decision, according to scholars, and Till Mobley herself, who writes about it. Moten argues that this mother sought to ignite what he has, quote, the passion of a seeing that is involuntary and uncontrollable, a seeing that redoubles itself in sound, a passion that is redoubling of Emmett Till's passion, of whatever passion would redeem, crucifixion, lynching, middle passage. Mark writes that Emmett's mother's courage, outrageous performance of grief, the need to show her murdered son to the world, turned one woman's unfathomable loss into a nation's activism and change, brought living energy and power where there was only hatred and death. And so we see why she remains an icon. This decade, or decades past this mother's loss, we have many instances where we see this, right? We have mothers wailing, we have them protesting, we have them declaring that Black Lives Matter and demanding that we say her name. And I'll offer a few examples that you all probably know about. February 26, 2012, teenage Trayvon Martin was shot and killed in Sanford, Florida, which is 30 minutes from where I went to high school. Months later, on November 2nd, 2013, teenage Renisha McBride was shot and killed in Dearborn Heights, Michigan. On August 9, 2014, teenage Michael Brown was shot and killed by a law enforcement officer in Ferguson, Missouri. Their mothers mourned and wailed publicly. The Martin case sparked outrage and protest and prompted dialogues about racism in the U.S. Martin's death became a part of what we now know as a series of killings, which reinvigorated the civil rights movement and ushered in a new generation of social justice activists and strategists, most of whom had a cell phone, and that's how they were able to make these things actual stories. Yet the cries of their mothers, particularly Michael Brown's mother, moments after he was shot, seemingly brought a city to its knees, and many of those watching around the world to their feet in protest. Michael's mother joined a chorus of black women who had and continued to publicly mourn and call for justice, and communities responded. And so we also got to see Michael Brown's funeral. Did anybody watch that? That was a hard one to watch. So the public broadcast of Michael's funeral offered a similar moment to that of Emmett's, allowing viewers, let me see if I have a picture of it. Nope. Allowing viewers access to his mother's grief. His mother, Leslie McSpadden, joined Emmett's mother in allowing the world to see their pain as their sons too were taken by in and by racially charged deaths. But before the funeral, it was photographs of McSpadden. Now I want you to see what she looks like. I think I have her here. So this is the picture in red, which we know, the traditional color to wear for funerals, is mostly black, but she wears red. Her family wears different kinds of red pieces, so she's sitting here with her head in her lap. So before the funeral, it was photographs of this mother in the moments and days after law enforcement personnel shot her unarmed teenage boy that circulated. She's later photographed, and this is the photo here, at her son's funeral. In one photo, she sits at the church pew next to her husband, wearing a red dress, defying traditional funeral attire. Her shoes are off and her hands are in her lap as she cries. She shares, like Till Mobley, this private moment of grieving for the cameras. These wailing black women, these wailing black mothers, dare viewers to imagine their pain. So if we go back to the first 48, I wanted to imagine it as this revolutionary thing where, black women, kind of changed what the show was supposed to be, but I had to also recognize the limitations of that, right? Not all things that are meant to disrupt actually disrupt completely. And so while the show itself, they defend their content and they say it is just entertainment, the creator and producer of the first 48 proclaimed that they are doing a public service. In an article about the show filming in Miami, co-creator and producer John Kim says that the show is the only one on television that chronicles, and I want to say this slowly, the real suffering of families and the ongoing violence in African American communities. And he says, quote, "This is the face of urban violence. Keeping it out there in the public consciousness is important. It's easy to forget what's happening." That's one of the people who created and produces the show, expresses a clear intent of representing violence in African American communities, although the show only also features Latinos and working class and poor white people, offers a very important information that makes sense of the fact that almost half of the adults killed on the show in one season were black. That he explicitly identifies black people as both urban and as the face of violence also facilitates our understanding of why the producer focuses on these cities and these urban centers. And while he may want to keep this issue in the public consciousness, it is his own words that confirm the need for us to ask for better and more complex representations of people of color. 48 technically has a positive representation, right? Because they also have law enforcement people of color, right? And and they're the good guys in this show. But as we take seriously the question of what kinds of feelings the show cultivates, again, going back to Herman Gray, and how it positions some people as distant outsiders and possible neighbors, the show's power becomes even more visible, right? So who do we feel for when we watch the show? The first 48 and Kim's comments keep violence, death, and blackness intertwined in the public consciousness. Kim explicitly contributes hegemonic representations of black people as violent, perpetrating a fear of blackness, and preventing identification and empathy. Black women wailing on this show at times interrupt Kim's narratives and reveal the face of state control, state neglect, the effects of deindustrialization, failing school systems, neighborhoods that are overly surveyed, prisons that absorb entire households. These moments of disruption, however, are fleeting with this fast-paced show, because the show goes, it's like this, right? They cut clips and go back and forth. So when Dominique cries, we'll go back to the woman that we met earlier, when Dominique cries and recalls her boyfriend dying on the street, asking him not to leave her, she says, I told him not to go, I love him, right? She says these things, she says he had kids to live for. These moments have the potential to touch on parts of our shared humanity, right? That as humans, there's a desire for love, there's a love of family, there's a desire for safety. So in these moments, we can attach to her feelings. Through her tears, they tell stories of these young black men who were fathers, they were partners, they were loved by others. Yet, if, as some media theorists have argued, the repeated exposure over time desensitizes viewers to this moment. And so I ask, what becomes of our humanity when we become desensitized to Black death? The Wailing Black Women challenges Kim's assertions about Blackness and compels us to ask about the sources of suffering. And so still this show truncates her political power because she comes and she goes and she's edited in and out. And so I want to end with one of my, I think my new favorite of these women, because she is about that life, as the young kids say. And so this is Valerie Castile. So, and so while the Wailing Black Women's political power appears faintly on the first 48, the show gives us a chance to think about the political power, the powerful ways that Black women in other settings deploy wailing and mourning. The Wailing Black Woman is like a siren. Once she is heard, her voice lingers. Even though the show's producers focuses on the narrative of hyper Black on Black violence, and we know, according to every statistic, that most violence is between people of the same race. And so people are like, Black on Black violence, I'm like, yes, and everybody on everybody violence, right? So most violence occurs within the same racial groups. If you didn't know that, enjoy the fact. Many young Black men were killed by the state, or those who felt protected by the state, right? So we go back to these examples of Emmett Till and Michael Brown. There exists many Black women whose cries do not get heard. But if we go back to the lyrics of Sweet Honey in the Rock, it doesn't matter where you're living. The women gather crying, tears that fill a million oceans. Their tears collectively gather and create waves that move people to action. Wailing Black women express sadness, but also anger and frustration. So it's not just, I'm sad. It's also, I'm angry, and we need to do something about this. So they speak to today's issue while connecting them to historical moments. Again, Michael Brown's mother, Till's mother, shed tears for the world to watch on CNN. But it was her community that heard her initial screams and stood by her. And so we have Valerie Castile, who on June 16, 2017, we know the Castile case a little bit, okay? Joined these women speaking at a press conference where the law enforcement personnel who killed her son while he was in his car with his girlfriend and a child, and his child is found not guilty on these charges. Traditional news and social media outlets use only sound bites of her presumably speaking in anger, marking her as different than the other mothers who recently lost their children in a similar fashion. But it's what she says and her call for action that aligns her with other highly visible black women mentioned earlier. She said she's had enough, and I'll read her quote here. People have died for us to have these rights, and now we're devolving. We're going back down to 1969. Damn. What is it going to take? I'm mad as hell right now. Yes, I am. So Castile identifies the systemic reasons for her pain and anger. So she's had enough Black death, enough racism, enough class oppression. She says, quote, "The system continues to fail Black people, and it will continue to fail you all." Like I said, because this happened with Philando, when they get done with us, they're coming for y'all. Y'all are next. And you will be standing up here fighting for justice as well as I am. And so she names the states and its citizens as responsible parties for her son's death. A city that she says her son loved. She talks about how much he loves the city. And so while the state of Minnesota did not literally kill her son, her statement points to the media culture and society that frames Black people as a threat, and the votes of a jury of fellow citizens who returned this non-guilty verdict. So Castile indicts all who are involved, in addition to the person who actually shot her son. Thus, she's marking racism and classism as systemic and deadly. And beyond death, classism and racism are activated in assessing the value of one's life via who is at fault for their death. So Castile warns us that although it is Black people who are being killed now, adding "you are next," ringing the alarm, much in the way that the famous poem, First They Came, we know this poem, First They Came for the Socialists, warned. She warns of systemic elimination of vulnerable populations and the cost of complicit, silent neighbors. In the past few years, from 2012 to 2017, of course, we can add 2019, 2018 to that, with increasing frequency, the cries of Black women fill the air as the number of deaths of Black boys, Black girls, Black transgendered individuals grows. This number grows, we watch it grow. The women gather. And so I'll end, hopefully I have my slide. Yes, I do. I'll end this excitement, and it's actually utterly sad, right? So I'll end this by returning to the question that Rihanna asked us, which is what now? Although I offer no singular definition in terms of what the answer is, I want to offer 3 things for us to think about and meditate on through Black women's expression of grief, angst, and anger. First, one of the most haunting lines in Rihanna's song, when she's in this song, really I think becomes helpful in us thinking about the first 48. So she's talking about surveillance and technology, right? So the show itself, it records people through windows, it records people through doors, because we understand that you have to consent to be recorded, right? And so when people don't consent, they find other ways to record them, right? Like asking the mother to come outside, filming the woman in the interview room through the cracks of the door. And so we have to constantly think about this idea of surveillance, especially as technology makes surveillance even more easy and prevalent, particularly surveillance of already marginalized communities. And so before she's saying she wants to scream, Rihanna sings, "Whatever it is, it feels like it's laughing at me through the glass of a two-sided mirror. Whatever it is, it's just laughing at me." This surveillance scene plays out regularly on the first 48. And much like the first 48, a variety of people are pushing for law enforcement personnel to wear body cameras as a way to decrease the likeliness of abusing the public, and think about how that may benefit and lessen these things. But as in the case of Castile demonstrate, the body cameras offer the same vantage point as the camera in the show of the first 48, and that is from the perspective of the law enforcement. Valerie Castile's words discursively move us from trying to identify the whatever it is, which Rihanna sings about, or the source of the issue, rather than assuming that it's a singular, there's a singular way to end what is a part of centuries of systemic violence against people of color. Second, despite the proliferation of images of Black death, wailing Black women do and will likely to continue to implore us to deal with the source of these hard deaths. And so I'm defining hard deaths in contrast to this idea of a soft death, and this comes from a novel. A soft death can be swallowed with called home to be with the Lord, and we'll see her again in glory, and hard deaths get caught in the teeth like gristle. The lack of supernatural or spiritual narrative justifications leave open the possibilities for asking difficult questions about why the deaths occurred and how communities respond to them. Third, Sweet Honey in the Rock, saying that there is no rest for those who believe in freedom, adding, quote, until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mother's son. They continue to say, I need to be one in the number we stand as we stand against tyranny, and that teaching others to stand up and fight is the only way my struggle survives. Wailing black women make it clear that it is not enough to console her. Wailing black women do more than cry. Many mobilize, resist, and make evident that their loss is not individual but community-wide. They do what Audre Lorde calls us to do, which is turn anger into action. We're done. So I will take questions, comments. I usually say I'll take cash, but it's kind of, I'm being recorded, so I won't say that. Yes.
Okay, so I'm hoping to get to a question eventually.
Okay.
So thanks for this talk. It's obviously an important talk to have, and I want to go back to one of the previous slides that you did, or that had up there that made me think of something. So let me just kind of talk about it. When you were talking about the images of Amy Bradley and Fred Scott Key, I was thinking of the images of the mothers of the movement. One of the things that popped out was the difference of Coretta, right? That she has this, she's not losing it, so to speak, right? And I was also thinking about this in terms of what you mentioned on a slide in terms of respectability politics.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if part of thinking about the Wailing Black Woman is this is also an internal movement response or resistance to respectability politics. I mean, I don't know like the intention of like, I'm going
Right.
to wail so I can say respectability politics. If it's functioning
Right.
In that way.
Right.
If
Right.
that makes any sense.
It does, yeah. And so one of the things that I don't do here, but I do in the sort of the broader project, because I was gung-ho on whaling, because I'm like, whaling is the most powerful thing you can do. But also, the more that I've read about from black anthropologists who write about black women responding to these kinds of deaths, doing nothing is okay, silence is okay. And there was something that was about Coretta that became as iconic as Emmett Till, right? Not more powerful, but as iconic. And so these are women who've had to figure out under cameras how to respond appropriately, right? And I think what Till's mother did, I think, made room for Castile's mother, right? Because you have Trayvon Martin's mother, who's actually very poised in her responses, and you have Michael Brown's mother, who's less poised. And these are also incredibly classed, right? Trayvon Martin's mother has a PhD, and Michael Brown's mother, right, is running for office, but doesn't have the same class status. So I don't know that they necessarily, that I can't sort of guess that they're like, we're going to fight respectability politics, but I think what's important is to understand there's a range of responses, and that allows for us to, so the audience responds to different things, right? Some audience members are like, oh, I can't deal with people crying, right? And so I think there's a range that allows for different people to tap into different understandings of what the women are going through. And that range, and acknowledging that range and writing about what the different things do, I think becomes really important. So it's not just here's how to respond, right, to these deaths, right? There's multiple ways to do it, all of which are valid and all of which are really important.
Yeah, and I think that, also with the Till Bradley example, I'm always struck by the kind of, there's that image of Mamie, but in some of her speeches, right? There's that sense of, when she tells the story of it, that she isn't
Right.
It's this, what I call like this distant intimacy at the same time, like the way that she does that. And
Yeah.
just even seeing the range of responses that she
Yeah.
and that circulate at that time, I
Right.
think is also, I don't know, like I said, I don't have a question, I'm just
Yeah, no, no, it's great. Yeah, it's great.
about all the
Right. I mean, there's also there's a long history. So these are women who have to sort of also I think they know. There's a long history of Black women's any kind of feeling being like not legible, right? And so if she cries, she's too emotional. If she doesn't cry, she's stoic and feels nothing. If she yells, she's irrational. So you have women who are contending with things that most of us can't even imagine, having to also think about sort of like what's going to be legible to different populations. And I think that it feels quite impossible, but I think they've managed it in different ways. The reason I like Castile is because she's not interested in making people feel good about what just happened, right? And so, and she cusses. I enjoy that too. Because we're also told, right, if you're a mother, you're supposed to be this specific kind of way. But again, there's a long history of Black women not having access to sort of that kind of motherhood to begin with. And so I think she's one of the ones that really, I think she understands that, and she just lets herself do her kind of intervention. Yeah. Thank you.
So one thing I think about with the Wailing Black Mother and death, it's kind of how typically we normally have like this. We tend to think we have a concrete idea of what death is. But I'm thinking about like James Carey, who says that actually the definition of death is dependent upon the means who gives it. And so I'm thinking, especially with the work you're doing and engaging in like feminist anthropology, how this will very interesting work. What does the Wailing Black Mother tell us, particularly around issues of like blackness, death, and citizenship? I know citizenship.
Right. It's a thing. It's a thing that I study. Yeah. So the definition of death. So the good news is that I don't have a definition of death, right? So in the beginning of the project, I spent a lot of time on what I call state-sanctioned deaths. But then I'm moving to thinking about like different responses to death, like in different contexts. So one of the places that the book takes me is to Rwanda, where it's kind of state-sanctioned death, kind of. And so I want to think about how women in Rwanda 25 years later, right, years after, as we're building this memorial, and there's all these interviews of how they remember their responses to these kinds of deaths, right? So a genocidal death versus a police death is very different. And I also go to Ghana. I actually just won a grant yesterday. P.S. Thank you. I'm going back to the mothership, which I find so much joy with those trips. So I'm going to Ghana to talk about women who are professional whalers, right? So these are natural deaths or less in our minds less violent deaths, but their work also does something very very specific. And so my definition of death, I think, will be different with every chapter and with every site that I touch. And I want I was like, I like the definition that it shifts. Does that answer the question at all? And citizenship, yeah. So my first book was on citizenship, right? How does media represent immigrants, different immigrants, and how that tells us about who belongs, who doesn't belong. And so I'm always interested in who we imagine as being our neighbors, who we imagine as belonging to a place, and who we imagine as not, because the not becomes quite important, especially if we think about things like who do we exclude, who do we mourn when they die, who do we protest when they die, who do we sue when someone is killed, right? And then which cases when and which ones don't. And so a part of thinking about Black death is that, so the first 48, I think, very much tells us, and all of these shows that are sort of along Law and Order and death genres tell us about who we should feel for, right? So when you have the shows, who watches the prison, like Lock Up, all those prison shows? You can tell me if you do, it's okay. It's like, oh my gosh, how could you do it? Those are hard things to watch.
And referring back to, you slightly brought up the school to prison pipeline, but there's this show about juvenile.
Scaled Straight.
No,
Oh.
it's different. So it's not where they like hypothetically put children in. They go into this women's prison, like juvenile prison, and they show like how these children are like dealing with things. And if you look towards like 60
Right.
of it, like when it's a hypothetical situation but in a real prison, it's kind of interesting to see like how these children are in such an adult situation, how they like have a lot of the same reactions and problems like that these adult prisoners do. So it's crazy that our society has just become so like incorporated around like
Prisons.
prisons.
Prisons, yeah. And when I think the way that these shows are produced, they tend to make us feel good, right? And so when if you watch Oz or all of these prison-based shows, it shows the people who are incarcerated. It's like, oh, thank goodness that they're away from us, right? And so similarly, when we talk about death, we also think about how do we respond to different kinds of death? So the narratives of death and the narratives of pushing back against death also for me is about telling us who belongs, who can die certain kinds of deaths, and what that means. So I think the censorship thing is also deeply embedded in thinking about belonging and feelings. Yeah.
We're all leaving because we have class.
Okay. Yeah, there was one here.
Yeah, so you actually kind of brought it up in response to this question about the evocative and the expressive, right? So the professional whaler, right? The one who is called out to wail and one who wails spontaneously,
Right.
which also relates to, so those are, one is how do we account for those two different questions?
Right.
The other one, as a critical audience, so when you're talking about whaling across racial lines, right? One of the easy things is just to discount it as fake, right? Well, it's all just for show, right? And that's because you're not in sympathy with the person, which goes back to the same thing about the evocative versus the expressive, right? Which is I'm not buying it, right? So any community where you see people mourning for the people you just killed,
Right.
is immediately, well, you shouldn't care about children,
Right.
whatever.
Right.
So how do you? So I guess those two things. How do you overcome that resistance if there's no innate sympathy already?
Right.
Right. Whaling can be easily dismissed,
Right.
or explained away as a performance.
Right.
Right. So,
Yeah, no, I don't know yet. So one of the things that I confess, because my grandmother died 2 years ago, and our aunt, and I'm from Haiti, I had to go back to Haiti for it, and our aunt was sitting next to me, calm as could be, and then she falls out. And I immediately was just like, what just happened? Like she was good, and then she fell out, and then they picked her up, and then she was fine again. And so it's hard. I mean, for me, there was a moment where it's like, my aunt is also quite a performer, and so I had to check myself and thinking like, I can't say it's a performance, right? Because this is her mother. And so, I mean, the fact that any response to these kinds of deaths, so I'm talking about the sort of the U.S. Black deaths, any response to those are just like, they're just being dramatic. What did these people do to deserve it? I think that immediately presents a challenge of us feeling for the mothers and feeling for the community that responds to it. And I don't necessarily have a way to push back against it except to actually incorporate sort of the fuller story of like, here's why this is a media response, right? So the good thing that's happened, I think folks are paying more attention to how media functions, is typically when Black people are killed, there's an immediate story about like what was wrong with them, what they were wearing, what they were smoking, what they were whatever, what they did when they were 16. And so you have a lot of families now who know this is what happens and immediately begin to shift that narrative, even if it's via social media. So there's work that people know that they have to do. So after the Emmanuel Church shooting in South Carolina, do y'all remember that one? The families, and it was instant, right? The families recognized, I think, that the shooter would be seen as a troubled young man, and then they would try to find what was wrong with the people who were killed. They were at church, right? So there was an immediate campaign on social media to talk about these are people, right? This is a mother, this is a father, this is a fraternity member. And so that's one way to push back, is to create a more rich narrative about who the people are, because we know that the easiest inclination is to say, what were they doing, right? So the young woman who was killed in her house, she was playing video games, right? And so there's an immediate shift to what did she do wrong? It's like she was in her house, right? So I think offering those counters, I think, really helps with the lack of empathy and the lack of sympathy.
that's interesting. That
Yeah.
was the genre of good stuff.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. We'll go this way. Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear, Danielle, kind of thinking about that across borders.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm very interested on. particularly on that moment, the discourse of what the state
Mm-hmm.
has become central in gaining momentum and kind of thinking as a society, what does the state does that kind of allows for this kind of death to a person, what are the consequences
Right.
that we should, in terms of accountability to the state.
Right.
So I'm just curious to see if you have or are planning on kind of forming on that and whether there is a discourse or there might be a discourse among black intellectuals movement about thinking through it was the state or it is the state that is allowing for this
Right.
killing to take place.
Right. And I think in most cases, it's not, so the state becomes this big thing that has prongs. So in case of Trayvon Martin, it was technically not the state, but someone who felt he was a part of the state, right? And so I think one of the ways to address this idea of how do we hold the state accountable is for us to really think about how far the state can go, right? So if you go to so people have been like arrested in the mall or shot in the mall, and these are not actually police officers who were doing the shooting, but mall security. And so what I encourage and what I want to do, what I try to do is to really not think of the state as like, right, people who technically work for the state, but people who are in alignment with state ideology, but also are protected by the state, right? So one of the redresses for some of these deaths have been suing in civil court because people have recognized that criminal court does not work, right? So when you have a person of color who is killed by whoever, that there's less likelihood of the state holding the killer accountable, mostly because of how we understand people of color in this specific context. And so we recognize then that civil is one place to do it, right? Or media becomes another place to hold people accountable. So my response is like, can we stretch our definition of the state as a way to really get to all of the ways that violence is function? So there's a book that I teach. It's Terrorizing Women. And they do a really good job of talking about, this is the US-Mexico border where women disappear, right? And there's no accountability because the state's like, we're not doing it. And so that's one of the places where we see a need to really challenge our understanding of why violence has happened and who is held accountable. In this case, why is no one being held accountable? Yeah. There's a hand behind you, Bryce. Yeah.
My question is, I think you touched on this just a little bit, when did you expand? So I'm thinking particularly of the US context with kind of Black Lives Matter and people that were not who were Black young men.
Right.
And in many cases, historically, these deaths have been, normalized.
Right.
What is it about the way Black women that denormalize these kind of deaths?
Yeah.
Bring it to our attention.
Right. Yeah, the fact that there's like that we can name so many people and not get sad by it is actually really hard too. So I think the normalization of Black death is not new. So there are cases. So we'll use examples of the U.S. slavery, right? When if a slave died or a slave escaped, that the slave owner could get money back. From they can sue and get money back from the state. So our presence and absence in spaces has never been exceptionally, I think, sort of important. Right, right. So a part of it is, so when these disappearances happen, and there's a lot of women who are disappearing too, it's usually, so the news story says this thing happened, the end, right? But it's usually that someone comes and says, this was a person, right? This was a person. So part of what these mothers have had to do is like, this person, this was his personality. These were his likes and dislikes. So I think the Wailing Mother adds a human dimension that most of the coverage about these deaths doesn't happen. So typically we focus on like, what were the issues or challenges of the killer, right? And so we focus on like the defense of the killer. We focus on them. And the Wailing Black women say, no, we need to focus on the person who's actually gone. And so I think she adds a human dimension that is otherwise lacking in other places.
Related to that, what would you say, what is the burden of that work?
Yeah, that's the, and it's labor, right?
We just lost a child.
Right,
To do that work,
right,
to prove to,
right. And it's only some mothers who have to do that, right? So some mothers lose their children, there's automatic sympathy, right? And so it's like, and it's an extra burden. And you also see, so I'll use the case not of a mother but of a daughter of Erica Gardner, right? Her father's murdered, and so she then takes up the mantle of becoming sort of this public figure, and then she dies, right? And you can also imagine for her like the stress on her body. Of having to do this kind of public work, and also the incredible vile attacks that she had to experience. And so, yeah, we do have to, and I do, and will account for sort of like, why do we have to do so much work just to exist, right? And when we die, why so much work just to say that our lives were worth living? And that's a burden that we should all have to reckon with. No. So that's the last chapter of the book. So the last chapter is called Who Wails for Us? Because, again, there's this long history of black women's activism, but when we die, there's a really awkward silence. And so there are a few examples. Both of them are from Texas, right? Sandra Bland and Antonia recently. But generally, when black women die in these ways, there's not the same kind of coverage, there's not the same kind of mobilization, and we understand, patriarchy is one hell of a drug, right? That's a part of why this happens. So we can ask this question, right? How have we valued black women's lives in this space to begin with? And that's a part of why there's such a lack of reaction. So that's the last chapter of the book where I contend with the absence of sound of action when black women die. So thank you for that. You got give the chapters away. Yes.
So it's not really a question, but a connection I was making, right?
Awesome.
And so, right now when I was thinking, like, during your presentation, about the weeping woman and like the weeping woman, the wailing woman, I couldn't help but think of another female representation that's used in Latinx culture, La Llorona.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that also translates to the weeping woman. Granted, it's more of a horror folklore.
Right.
In relation to it, because she's the one that actually kills her children, in a different context, it's a
Right,
different
right,
context that you're
right,
presenting
right.
here. But I was thinking about the two representations
Yes.
context, and so I guess if there is a question I do have to ask, is this idea of the weeping woman primarily dedicated to just people of color, or could it be like any female in general?
Right. So I study black women. I study black people. So it could be, but it's not for me. And I think that wailing of different people, it does different things and different responses. So we have like when some women just have a single tear, the world has to stop to attend to that tear, versus others could be on the ground, like immobile, and people just like walk around her, right? So for me, I'm interested specifically in black women. And if you, in a few years, have an article, I'm actually creating, so the book itself exists, focusing on black women, but I'm doing an edited volume that talks about the wailing women, mostly women of color, in other places. So Latin America becomes a really important place. The continent becomes a really important place where this figure does different things, but she exists across these different spaces. So I'll take your article if you write one. Dr. Henson.
To go back to the question of the state,
Yeah.
state sanctioning violence and its silence, could that still be, so for example, like with Trayvon and Zimmerman, right? Can we still think about that as state sanctioned violence in terms of citizenship, in the sense of, one way I've conceptualized it, I don't know if this fits, but like protection from the state, so the state not killing you, but also protection by the state, right? Like these are your political rights.
Right.
And so, is there a way to connect those two to say this is also lack of citizenship on multiple fronts?
Yes. So the state of the Florida state, that's the wrong school and everything. So someone was wearing maroon is throwing me off. It's like, 'cause they're maroon. So a part of what happens with the Martin case is that we see sort of the discrepancies in Florida law and which people could actually claim citizenship and enact the laws, right? So Florida, stand your ground. So Martin says he was standing his ground nowhere near his house, right? And he's acquitted. So the state says, okay, you have the right to use this law. We have a young woman, I can't remember her name, and she fired a warning shot because her estranged spouse was beating her. So she fired a warning shot. He was not injured. She gets sentenced to 25 years, and she could not stand her ground, right? And so a part of what that case shows us is citizenship says you have rights and responsibilities as a citizen, right? But who can and who's able to use it successfully tells us the limitations of that, of who's actually treated as a citizen. So a black woman trying to defend herself versus Zimmerman trying to defend, I don't know what he was trying to defend, different responses. And we see this happening across the board with who is able to use what kind of defense, who can defend their lives under what circumstances and not go to jail for it. So that's a clear, for me, that's a clear place where citizenship has, has a divide, right? Yeah. These are great questions. Thank you for staying after 12:30. I appreciate it. I'm happy to talk after too, so let me know.
Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, I'm at very, very early. Sorry, my name is Portia, by the way.
Manushka.
Yeah,
Nice
I'm
to
a
meet
visiting
you.
assistant professor here.
Nice.
Yeah.
Are you a part of the ACES?
Yes,
Awesome.
yes,
Awesome.
yes. I'm coming from the UK, so
Awesome.
I'm very, very early beginning stages of looking at death and the afterlife
Oh,
in West
wow.
African and African American literature. So